Elena Rossi just wanted one quiet night. No patience, no alarms, no one needing her, just music, lights, and a drink. She didn't have to rush. But the moment she walked into that club, she felt it, the kind of energy that makes you look over your shoulder. Eyes followed her, whispers spread, and somewhere in the crowd, a man watched her, like he already knew her story. By the time she realized who he was, it was too late. Her past had just walked in, and someone dangerous was about to take her side. The club shimmered with soft gold lights that made everything look perfect, almost too perfect. Elena tried to blend in, sitting near the back where shadows offered safety. Her shoes pinched a little, her dress felt borrowed, but she didn't care. For once she wasn't the nurse, the caretaker, the one fixing broken things. She was just a woman trying to disappear for a few hours. The beat of the music pulsed through the floor, and she let it drown out her thoughts, unaware that someone else was already studying her every move. She ordered a drink she rarely had, something sweet, cold, and strong enough to silence the noise in her head. The bartender smiled too much, asking her name, but she brushed it off with a polite nod. She didn't want to be seen, only to exist quietly. Yet the city had other plans. In the corner of the room, a group of men in sharp suits whispered to each other, their attention drifting toward her. She noticed, turned away, and tried to convince herself it was just her imagination playing tricks again. Her phone buzzed twice, messages from the hospital about a patient who wouldn't stop asking for her. She turned the screen face down, refusing to look. Tonight wasn't for duty or guilt. She'd spent her whole life showing up for others, but never for herself. The thought stung. She stirred her drink, watching the ice spin, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to feel tired. Not the kind of tired sleep fixes, but the kind that lives deep in your bones, where even silence doesn't reach. Laughter rose from a nearby table. Expensive perfume, diamond bracelets, and perfect smiles. Elena envied how easily they belonged. She caught her reflection in the mirror behind the bar, saw the faint lines near her eyes, the tired curve of her shoulders, and wondered when she'd started fading into the background of her own life. A part of her wished to be invisible. Another part craved to be noticed just once, for the right reasons. That quiet tug-of-war inside her had been there for years, a contradiction she couldn't name. When she looked back toward the crowd, she noticed him, a man sitting alone in the farthest booth, half hidden behind the glint of his glass. Matteo DeLuca. Even she knew the name. The one whispered in back rooms, printed in headlines, and feared in the alleys of the city. He looked calm, almost detached, but his presence pulled the air around him tighter. Their eyes met for less than a second, but it felt longer, like the world had just taken a small, deliberate breath between beats of a song. Elena looked away quickly, pretending to check her phone, though she hadn't touched it again. She didn't believe in fate or destiny, only timing, and hers always seemed terrible. Matteo didn't move, didn't gesture, yet she felt something shifting, like the room itself had taken notice of her. She finished her drink faster than she meant to, and told herself she would leave after one more song, but she didn't. Instead, she stayed, trapped by a strange pull she didn't understand, one that whispered she was safer here than outside. A waiter appeared beside her, setting down another drink. "Compliments of the gentleman in the corner," he said, motioning discreetly. She froze. The glass was filled with something different. Dark red, bold, expensive. Her first thought was to send it back. Her second was curiosity. She hesitated, fingers brushing the glass, before catching Matteo's faint nod from across the room. He wasn't smiling, he was watching her reaction, as if it mattered more than anything else happening in that club tonight. Against her better judgment, she took a careful sip. The taste surprised her. Rich, smooth, and familiar in a way she couldn't place. She set it down gently, scanning the room again. Matteo was gone from his booth. Her stomach tightened with confusion. She looked around thinking maybe she had imagined him, but then she noticed a folded napkin on the table beside her drink, placed there without her noticing. It was too neat to be random. She stared at it, unsure whether to open it or walk out. Right then, something inside told her both choices carried risk. Curiosity won. She unfolded the napkin slowly, revealing a few words written in simple black ink. "You look like someone I lost." Her chest tightened at the message, so direct, so strange. Lost how? Lost when? The sentence felt like an open door to a room she didn't want to enter. She looked around again, searching for him, but the crowd had swallowed him whole. Somewhere in the back, the music softened, the rhythm slowing as the lights dimmed slightly. The night had shifted, and she felt it deep in her chest. Matteo appeared again, walking toward her through the crowd. People moved aside without realizing why. He carried no drink, no smile, only the quiet authority of someone who never had to ask twice. Elena's pulse steadied instead of rising. That surprised her. He stopped near her table, said something softly she couldn't quite hear, and took the seat across from her. His gaze didn't wander. He studied her face with intent, like he was searching for an answer only she could give, though she didn't know what question he was asking. They sat like that for a while, two strangers surrounded by noise that didn't touch them. Matteo didn't speak much, but when he did, his words seemed to come from somewhere honest. He mentioned how rare it was to see calm in a place built on chaos. Elena didn't answer. She didn't trust herself to. Part of her wanted to leave, but another part wanted to see what he saw in her. The contradiction made her uneasy, yet she couldn't deny the strange comfort his presence carried with it. The club's energy shifted around them. Waiters moved faster, conversations lowered, and glances grew sharper. Elena noticed it before he did, how the atmosphere had changed. Something was wrong, though she couldn't tell what. Matteo's calm didn't break, but his attention moved elsewhere, scanning the room subtly. She followed his gaze toward the bar, where a man stood alone, leaning slightly forward, his stare locked on her. Her throat tightened. The room faded around that single look. She knew that posture, that stance, that simmering control. It was Marco. Years melted in an instant. The man she had left, the one she had run from across cities, was standing just a few meters away. Marco's presence was like a shadow she thought she had escaped, now cast across her again. He hadn't changed much. Same confidence, same tailored arrogance, same eyes that once told her she'd never be free. Matteo noticed her stillness. He followed her gaze and saw the man she couldn't stop looking at. Something silent passed between them, a recognition older than either of their words. Matteo's posture changed slightly. No longer relaxed, but coiled with purpose. He didn't ask questions. He already understood enough. The tension around the bar thickened as Marco's men began to move, pretending to mingle. Elena could feel the space shrinking. Matteo leaned closer, his voice low but certain. He told her to stay behind him. She wanted to argue, to reclaim control, but her instincts didn't let her. Marco started walking toward them, wearing the kind of smile that once looked like love, but had always meant danger. As Marco closed the distance, Elena's world shrank to the rhythm of footsteps and music. The two men stood facing each other, history and power written in their eyes. Matteo stayed calm, unflinching, while Marco's confidence filled the space like smoke. Elena understood that something irreversible had begun. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was the reason two powerful men had locked eyes in silence. Somewhere deep inside, a truth formed. She wasn't safe, but she wasn't helpless either. That night, her life had stepped out of the shadows for good. Matteo didn't take his eyes off Marco as he stepped closer. The crowd seemed to sense something building but couldn't tell what. Elena stayed behind Matteo like he'd told her. Though every instinct screamed to leave, she watched how Matteo's calm unnerved Marco. How the man she once feared didn't know what to make of the one standing between them. For the first time, Marco didn't have control. The power that used to crush her now looked small. Still, she knew that look in his eyes. He wouldn't leave quietly. Marco greeted Matteo with fake warmth, pretending they were old acquaintances. Matteo didn't play along. He stayed still, steady, giving no sign of emotion. Marco tried to provoke him, hinting at debts and history, speaking loud enough for nearby guests to hear. Elena understood this was not random. Marco had planned to find her, and seeing her with a man like Matteo only made things worse. She watched as Matteo's jaw tensed slightly, the only visible crack in his composure, a small warning that Marco was about to cross a line. Matteo stepped forward, closing the space between them. His tone stayed calm, but it carried weight that silenced the room. He told Marco to walk away while he still could. Marco smirked, the kind of smile that used to make Elena believe lies. He made a remark about Matteo hiding behind a woman, and that was enough to make Matteo's men shift from their seats. The quiet thrum of the club changed into something sharp, like electricity before a storm. Elena's hands clenched, wishing she could undo this night, but it was already too late. Elena noticed the staff whispering near the entrance, some quietly slipping away. This kind of tension didn't belong in a public place, not with these names involved. Matteo leaned slightly toward her, signaling something with a glance. His men responded without speaking, adjusting positions. It wasn't chaos yet, but it was close. Marco laughed again, asking why Matteo cared about her. The sound twisted Elena's stomach. She hated how Marco turned everything into ownership, like she was something to win back. Matteo didn't respond, only turned his gaze on Marco's men one by one. Matteo's stillness was more dangerous than any threat. Marco started to lose his composure, trying to sound in control but showing cracks. He said her name now, slowly, like he wanted the whole room to hear it. Elena flinched. It had been years since she'd heard it spoken like that. Possessive, sharp, almost mocking. Matteo turned slightly toward her then, just enough to remind her he was there. He didn't say anything, but she understood. Whatever history existed between those two men, it was no longer about power. It was about her. The air inside the club felt heavier. Even the music faded to a dull echo. Marco looked around, expecting someone to stop this, but nobody dared. Matteo leaned closer and said something quietly that made Marco's smile vanish. Elena couldn't hear what it was, but Marco stepped back, startled, before forcing a grin again. She realized Matteo wasn't fighting for dominance. He was drawing a line that no one had ever dared to draw for her. Marco's confidence faltered, but pride kept him there, trapped between anger and fear. Elena's memories flooded back. Marco's charm that turned to control, his apologies that never meant change, the promises that always came with conditions. Now she was watching him face someone who didn't play by his rules. She could almost feel his panic beneath the surface. He wanted to make a scene, to reassert control the only way he knew, through intimidation. Matteo gave him nothing. His silence was louder than threats. The contrast between the two men struck her deeply. One destroyed what he couldn't own. The other protected what he didn't expect to find. The bartender pretended to wipe glasses, but kept glancing toward the corner. No one dared move too fast. The waiter stayed frozen mid-shift, unsure who would pay the price if things went wrong. Elena realized that in places like this, silence meant loyalty. Everyone knew which side they stood on. She watched as Matteo gave a small hand gesture, subtle enough that only his men noticed. They began guiding nearby guests toward the exits, pretending it was routine. Marco didn't catch it yet. He still thought he was the one with the upper hand. Elena's pulse steadied in an unexpected way. Fear was there, but it was clearer, sharper, easier to manage than before. Matteo's presence gave her a strange kind of courage, not because she trusted him, but because he didn't treat her like a possession. Marco noticed her calm and mistook it for defiance. He sneered, saying she'd changed. He was right. She had. The woman who once broke down in front of him no longer existed. Matteo glanced back once, just enough to meet her eyes, and in that brief moment she knew he understood. Marco's tone changed again, trying to sound persuasive. He spoke about the past, about things that didn't matter anymore. His words tried to wrap around her, to remind her of old dependencies, but they slid off this time. She watched Matteo's patience thinning. He wasn't emotional. He was methodical. Every second Marco spoke was another step toward a decision Matteo had already made. Elena could see it forming in his expression. This wouldn't end with words. She wanted to stop it, but she also knew nothing would stop what was coming next. The room shifted as more of Marco's men appeared from the crowd, pretending to be customers. Matteo noticed, his posture barely changing, but his eyes flicked toward the exits. He had already calculated everything: the angles, the exits, the witnesses. Marco underestimated him, thinking this was about pride. Matteo wasn't playing games. He was protecting someone, and that changed everything. Elena felt the pull between both men, the past that haunted her, and the danger that might save her. She had no idea which side of that line she belonged on anymore. The first sound of glass breaking snapped through the air. A waiter had dropped a tray. Startled by someone's sudden movement, that tiny sound was enough to set everything in motion. Matteo's men stepped forward, quiet but precise, blocking Marco's path. The rest of the club froze. Marco's arrogance turned to something else: uncertainty. He wasn't used to losing control in front of others. Elena stayed behind Matteo as instructed, watching two versions of her life collide in front of her eyes: the man she once feared and the one she didn't yet understand. Marco stepped closer again, trying to look braver than he felt. Matteo didn't move. He just raised his hand slightly, and the entire room seemed to respond. It was a warning, not a command. Marco stopped mid-step. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful, it was waiting. Elena could feel the weight of both their histories pressing down. For a moment, she almost pitied Marco. Almost. Then he looked at her, that same old possessive stare returning, and the pity vanished. Matteo's voice broke the stillness, firm and final, telling him to leave. Marco didn't move. He laughed instead, loud and forced. He tried to provoke Matteo, calling him a pretender who thought he could own what wasn't his. The words were meant to hurt, but Matteo didn't bite. He stood there like a wall. Elena's mind raced, trying to find a way out. Marco's laughter died when Matteo took a single step forward. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. Everyone nearby could feel the temperature drop in that invisible space between them. One wrong word, and the night would unravel. Marco's men tensed, waiting for a signal. Matteo didn't give one. He didn't need to. His calm was command enough. Elena stood still, unsure if she was watching protection or provocation. Matteo leaned slightly toward Marco, said something too quiet to hear. And whatever it was made Marco flinch. His smugness cracked. The entire room seemed to lean forward, waiting for a blow that didn't come. Matteo straightened his jacket, his eyes fixed on Marco's, as if daring him to speak again. Marco didn't. Not yet. Before we continue and find out what happens next, take a moment to pause the story. If you're enjoying it so far, tap the like button, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from. It helps more than you think. Marco's silence didn't last long. He gestured to one of his men near the bar, and that was enough for Matteo's guards to react. They moved with quiet precision, intercepting before anything could start. Elena stayed frozen, her mind flipping through memories she had tried to bury. Every move, every stare reminded her of the man Marco used to be before the cruelty. Matteo turned his head slightly, checking that she was still behind him. She was. She realized he wasn't just defending pride, he was defending her right to exist freely again. A faint vibration ran through the floor as the lights flickered once, maybe from a glitch in the power. The shadows deepened, colors fading into gray. In the distance outside, a bell rang faintly, maybe from the harbor or an old church nearby. The sound felt strangely placed, too timed to be random. Matteo glanced up once, then back at Marco. Elena noticed how steady he stayed, despite the chaos waiting to happen. Marco, on the other hand, looked smaller now, exposed without the power he once used to hide behind. Matteo's right-hand man leaned close and whispered something to him. Matteo nodded, still watching Marco. He told Elena to keep her head down, as his men started quietly guiding her toward a back hallway. She didn't want to leave, afraid of what might happen once she was gone. But Matteo's tone wasn't up for debate. Marco called out her name again, sharper this time, and she hesitated. Matteo's hand brushed hers briefly, reassuring, not possessive. That small gesture gave her the courage to move. She walked toward the hallway, heart steady but heavy. In the hallway, the music faded completely. The air was cooler there, quieter, with only distant voices echoing through the walls. One of Matteo's guards told her to wait while he made sure the way out was safe. She leaned against the wall, her thoughts spinning. Every part of her life felt like it was colliding tonight. The caretaker, the survivor, the woman who wanted peace. She heard muffled shouting from the club and flinched. She didn't know who would walk out alive, and that uncertainty made her realize how deep she was in. Elena stepped farther down the corridor, trying to steady her breathing. The lights flickered again. In a nearby room, she saw a table covered with half-finished drinks and a small birthday cake left untouched. Candles melted into wax puddles. She stared at it, oddly fixated. It reminded her of the birthday she spent alone last year, pretending she didn't care, hiding under a different name in a different city. The memory was bitter, but it grounded her. Life had moved her like a pawn, yet somehow she was still standing, still choosing. A sound from the other end of the hallway pulled her attention. She turned, expecting Matteo's guard. But it was Marco's voice, low and mocking, echoing closer. Her stomach dropped. He had slipped through. Panic pressed against her ribs, but she forced herself to think. She couldn't go back into the club. It was chaos. She spotted a door slightly open, the one leading to the staff storage room. Without thinking, she slipped inside and closed it behind her, keeping the light off. She listened carefully, every creak of the floor sharper than before. Inside the dark room, her eyes adjusted slowly. She saw boxes, cleaning supplies, and a small window high up that looked out onto the alley. Footsteps approached outside the door. Marco's voice came through, soft and deliberate, saying he just wanted to talk. The sound froze her in place, but she didn't respond. She stayed silent, forcing her breathing to match the hum of the refrigerator nearby. The footsteps moved away for a second, then came back, stopping right outside. She realized Marco wasn't guessing. He already knew she was in there. Before he could open the door, another sound broke through, the unmistakable crack of something heavy hitting the wall. Matteo's voice followed, sharp and calm, telling Marco to walk away while he could. The tone wasn't angry, it was final. The footsteps shifted. Silence stretched again, followed by Marco's retreating steps. Elena exhaled quietly, relief washing through her, but she knew it wasn't over. Matteo had found her again, but so had trouble. She didn't know whether to be grateful or terrified. Either way, she wasn't alone anymore, and that mattered. Matteo opened the door slowly, his face shadowed but steady. He checked the corners, then looked at her. His shirt sleeve was torn, blood staining the fabric. He didn't explain what had happened, only asked if she was hurt. She shook her head, unable to form words. Matteo nodded once and gestured for her to follow. His men had cleared the way, but the sounds from the main room told her the night wasn't done. They walked together down the narrow hallway, their steps quiet but certain. Safety felt close, yet still far. They exited through a side door that led into the rain-soaked alley. The city lights reflected in puddles, blurring into streaks of gold and red. Matteo stopped near the car, waiting at the curb, his expression unreadable. He told her to get in, and she obeyed. The door shut softly behind her, muffling the chaos they'd left behind. Through the glass, she saw him take a call, his tone controlled but urgent. For the first time that night, she understood. Whatever world Matteo lived in, it had rules of its own, and she had just entered it. The car drove through narrow streets, slick with rain. Elena watched the reflections blur past, her mind still replaying the scene inside the club. Matteo sat beside her, phone pressed to his ear, speaking in quiet Italian that sounded both calm and dangerous. She couldn't understand the words, but she understood tone. This wasn't over. He hung up, finally looking at her. His gaze was unreadable, part concern, part calculation. She realized he wasn't used to explaining himself. Neither was she. Both of them carried lives built on silence and survival. They arrived at a tall building tucked between empty shops. Matteo led her through a side entrance guarded by a man who didn't ask questions. Inside, the walls were lined with framed photos and soft light. It wasn't what she expected from someone like him. It felt like an old apartment turned into an office, lived in but controlled. Matteo handed her a towel to dry off, then poured 2 glasses of water. She wanted to thank him but couldn't find the right words. Gratitude and fear didn't fit together easily in her mouth. Matteo sat opposite her, resting his elbows on the table. He asked her how long she'd been running. She hesitated, unsure how much to share, then told him just enough. He didn't interrupt, didn't push for details, just listened with an attention that felt unfamiliar. She told him Marco wasn't just an ex. He was the reason she left everything behind. Her city, her name, her peace. Matteo nodded, his face tightening at certain parts. He didn't promise protection. He didn't need to. His silence said he had already made up his mind. Elena noticed a small object on the shelf behind him, a snow globe missing its base. Inside it, a figure stood alone under falling glitter. It looked oddly fragile in the room of steel and leather. She wondered why he kept it. Matteo caught her glance and said it belonged to his brother, someone he couldn't save. That was all he said, and it was enough. She understood loss when she saw it. Both of them carried ghosts they didn't talk about, but theirs seemed to recognize each other quietly across the table. The power flickered once more, casting shadows across the room. A guard outside the door muttered something, and Matteo stood, checking the hallway before locking the door. He told her Marco wouldn't stop now. She already knew that. She asked him why he got involved at all. Matteo looked down, fingers brushing the glass of water he hadn't touched. He said she reminded him of someone who didn't get the chance to walk away. That was the closest he came to admitting anything personal. She nodded, understanding more than she let on. Hours passed. The rain outside softened into steady drips against the window. Matteo made a few more calls, then turned back to her. He told her she couldn't go home yet. Marco would look there first. She felt the weight of her life shrink, one more night of hiding, one more reason to stay alert. Matteo gave her his jacket, heavy and warm, smelling faintly of tobacco and rain. She wanted to believe she was safe, but safety had always been temporary for her. Trust wasn't something she gave easily anymore. Matteo asked if she had anyone she could call, anyone she trusted. She thought about her mother, about the unanswered messages sitting in her phone. She wanted to reach out, but couldn't bring danger to anyone else. She shook her head. Matteo seemed to expect that answer. He told her to rest, but the thought of sleeping felt impossible. She sat on the couch, listening to the hum of the building, realizing that no matter where she went, her past followed close behind, always one step behind her shadow. When morning came, light crept through the blinds. Matteo was gone from the room, but a cup of coffee sat waiting on the table. She took a sip and noticed a folded piece of paper underneath it, a note written in the same sharp handwriting she'd seen on the napkin. It said, "Stay inside. Don't open the door for anyone but me." She didn't know if it comforted or frightened her. Outside, car horns echoed faintly, and the city looked normal again. The contrast between peace and danger was dizzying. She walked around the small apartment, noticing details she'd missed. On one shelf sat a stack of unsent postcards addressed to cities all across Europe. Some had no names, only places: Naples, Berlin. She turned one over. No message, just a date from years ago. Maybe Matteo had once planned a different life, one that didn't involve locked doors and watchful eyes. It made her wonder what kept him here, what made him stay when everything about him felt like a man always halfway to leaving. A knock came at the door, not loud, but deliberate. Her stomach twisted. She remembered the note. She didn't move. The knock came again, slower this time. Then silence. She crept closer and looked through the peephole. Nothing. The hallway looked empty, but when she stepped back, a small envelope slid under the door. She froze. It was plain, unmarked, but she knew the handwriting instantly. Marco's. Inside was a single photograph, her from the night before, standing beside Matteo. On the back, written in blue ink, were two words: "You're mine." She felt her knees weaken, but refused to sit down. The message wasn't a threat. It was a declaration of ownership. Marco was playing his favorite game again, showing he could reach her anywhere. She tore the photo in half and threw it in the trash. The calm she felt wasn't real, just shock, stretching time thin. She needed to do something. She turned toward the door, ready to find Matteo, when it opened on its own. He stood there, expression unreadable, holding a phone in one hand and a storm in his eyes. He walked in without asking what was wrong. He already knew. He saw the torn photo in the bin and didn't need explanation. He said Marco wanted a reaction, not a war, but he'd get both if he kept pushing. Elena said she couldn't keep hiding. That running had only kept her scared. Matteo looked at her differently then, not as someone fragile, but as someone about to stand her ground. He told her they'd end it soon. She believed him, though she didn't know what ending it really meant in his world. That afternoon, Matteo's men brought her to another location, a small building near the docks. It smelled of salt and metal. He said it was safer here, quieter. She sat by the window, watching ships drift in and out of the harbor. It reminded her of the hospital nights, when she'd sit by sleeping patients, counting heartbeats, waiting for peace that never came. Matteo worked in the next room, speaking in low tones with someone on the phone. His control over chaos fascinated her, like watching fire obey someone's will. He came to her later, saying Marco's reach was deeper than expected. There were people in the city still loyal to him. Matteo wasn't afraid, but he looked tired. She saw something human behind the sharp edges, a man stretched between duty and something that felt like guilt. She asked him why he didn't just let it go. He said power isn't something you can walk away from once people know you have it. She understood that. Fear worked the same way. It followed you until you decided to face it. That night she couldn't sleep. The rain returned, soft against the window. She walked through the empty hallways and found Matteo in the kitchen, reading something on his phone. He looked up and didn't seem surprised to see her awake. She poured herself water and leaned against the counter. Neither spoke for a while. Then she asked him what he'd do if he could start over. Matteo said he'd open a small vineyard in Tuscany, somewhere quiet where no one knew his name. The answer made her smile, in spite of everything. Matteo noticed her smile and said she should think of a place too, a life outside hospitals and running. She tried but couldn't picture it. Every dream she had ended with her waking up alone. Matteo said that was only because she never stayed long enough to see what peace looked like. The words lingered with her. She wasn't sure if he meant himself or life in general, but they felt heavier than they should. For the first time, she realized she didn't want to leave just yet. That frightened her. The next morning, she woke to the smell of coffee again. Matteo was gone, but one of his men waited by the door, saying he'd be back soon. She nodded, pretending she wasn't nervous. She checked her phone. 10 missed calls from an unknown number. The same number appeared over and over. Marco. No messages, just silence. She blocked it, even though she knew it wouldn't stop him. She wondered what his endgame was. Control? Revenge? Or just proof that she'd never truly escaped? Each question felt heavier than the one before. Later that day, a power outage hit the entire block. The lights dimmed and went out, leaving only the gray glow from outside. The guard cursed under his breath, checking the fuse box. Elena's pulse quickened. The timing felt wrong. Matteo wasn't back yet. She moved closer to the window, watching the empty street. Then she saw it. A car parked too long near the corner, engine running but no one inside. She stepped back quietly, realizing Marco wasn't trying to call anymore. He was watching. And now he knew exactly where she was. Matteo returned moments later, his expression hard. He already knew. He ordered his men to relocate. They moved quickly, practiced, without panic. Elena followed, clutching her bag, her thoughts spinning. She asked if this was her fault, but Matteo told her it didn't matter whose fault it was. It mattered who finished it. His tone wasn't angry. It was resolute. She saw in him the kind of certainty she'd never had for herself. For the first time in years, she wasn't just reacting to fear. She was walking towards something instead of away. They moved her to another safe house on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by tall warehouses and the smell of the sea. Matteo said she'd be safe there, while he handled the rest. She didn't ask what the rest meant. She already knew it wouldn't involve words. He told her to stay inside, no matter what she heard. She agreed, but doubted she'd be able to sit still. When he left, the room felt colder, quieter, filled with the sound of her thoughts, chasing one another through the emptiness. Hours passed. She tried to read, but couldn't focus. Every shadow near the window looked like movement. She replayed Matteo's words in her head, his calm, his conviction, the strange trust he carried like armor. She realized she didn't know much about him. Not really, just fragments. A brother he couldn't save. A life he didn't want. A war he didn't start, but had to finish. She wondered if anyone ever saw him the way she did now, not as a boss or a name, but as a man tired of fighting. A sound from outside snapped her attention. A car door shutting too close. She froze, waiting. Then footsteps approached the entrance. She moved to the small kitchen, grabbed a metal pan without thinking. Absurd, but comforting. The door creaked slightly. A voice called her name. Mateos. She lowered the pan, relief washing over her, but something about the tone felt off. She walked closer, hands still tight on the handle. Through the small window in the door, she saw him standing there, but his eyes looked wrong, distant. Something wasn't right. She didn't open the door. Her instincts screamed against it. Mateo's voice repeated her name, softer now, almost pleading. She stepped back, remembering the rule, open for no one but him. But if this was him, why did it feel different? The voice came again, this time angrier, frustrated. She realized then it wasn't Matteo. Marco had found a way to mimic his tone, just enough to trick her. Fear surged, but she stayed quiet. The handle rattled once, twice, then stopped. Silence returned, heavy and waiting. She didn't move for a long time. When Matteo returned for real, she almost didn't believe it was him. His shirt was torn again, face marked by exhaustion. He asked what happened. She told him someone had used his voice. His eyes darkened. He said Marco was becoming desperate, losing control. He told her they had one last chance to end it cleanly before more people got hurt. She didn't ask how. She just said she was tired of being the reason for chaos. Matteo said she wasn't the reason. She was the excuse, and that made all the difference. That night, Matteo laid out a plan. He said Marco would expect him to come alone. He wanted Elena to stay hidden, but she refused. She said she needed to face the man who stole her years. Matteo didn't argue long. He saw the resolve in her eyes and nodded. They would end this together. The rain started again outside, steady against the windows. Elena realized this wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about reclaiming her voice, her choice, her peace. For the first time, she wasn't running. She was ready. The next evening arrived heavy with humidity and quiet streets. Matteo's car stopped near an abandoned warehouse by the docks. He told her to stay inside, but Elena shook her head. This was her fight too. Matteo didn't argue further. They stepped into the damp air together, the smell of oil and salt clinging around them. Inside, dim lights flickered above crates, stacked like walls. She could feel Marco's presence before she saw him, the same magnetic arrogance she had once mistaken for strength. This time, she wasn't the one trembling. Marco waited at the far end, leaning against a table covered with documents and old liquor bottles. He looked calm, too calm, which made Elena uneasy. Matteo stopped a few feet from him, shoulders squared, voice even. They exchanged words she couldn't hear clearly, but the meaning was obvious. Boundaries, power, threats. Marco's eyes flicked toward her, sharp and calculating. He smirked like he had already won. But Matteo didn't move the way she remembered men reacting to provocation. He was patient, letting silence do the work until Marco's confidence began to unravel. Elena stepped forward slightly, enough to draw Marco's attention. His smile faltered for the first time. He called her brave, but his voice trembled around the edges. She realized he wasn't in control anymore. Matteo had stripped away the illusion, leaving Marco exposed. Still, she didn't hide. She told him, calmly and clearly, that this was the last time he'd speak to her as if she were his. Marco's face hardened. Matteo didn't interrupt. He let her speak, letting her voice carry the strength it had been denied for years. Marco lunged first, not with a weapon, but with words meant to humiliate. He mocked Matteo, calling him soft, pretending to pity Elena. Matteo's patience thinned. He told Marco that control built on fear never lasts. Marco laughed, calling him naive. The sound echoed through the warehouse, brittle and hollow. Matteo moved closer, each step deliberate, controlled. He wasn't threatening violence. He was removing the last layer of power Marco thought he had. Elena saw it clearly now. Matteo didn't need to win a fight. He needed Marco to destroy himself. One of Marco's men shifted nervously, unsure whether to intervene. Matteo's men responded instantly, weapons low but ready. The tension balanced on a knife's edge. Marco looked at Elena again, hoping to find fear, but she met his stare without blinking. That broke him more than anything Matteo could say. He shouted her name, furious, like he was entitled to her attention. Matteo stepped in then, voice calm but final, telling him it was over. Marco's next move would decide everything. For the first time, Marco hesitated, and that hesitation cost him everything. The moment cracked open fast. Marco swung first, sending the table crashing. Matteo didn't flinch. His men reacted, disarming Marco's guard, the sound of metal hitting the floor echoing through the walls. Elena stayed back, clutching a crate for balance. Marco stumbled, trying to recover. But Matteo didn't press the advantage. He let him stand there, broken pride bleeding through. The war Marco thought he could win ended with his own collapse. He looked around and saw no loyalty, no fear, only people tired of his chaos. His empire had shrunk to nothing. When it was done, Matteo gave an order. Marco was escorted out, alive but finished. His power ended not with blood, but with silence. Elena stood watching, unsure whether to feel relief or disbelief. Matteo walked toward her, wiping his hands on his coat, expression unreadable. He asked if she was all right. She nodded, unable to describe the mix of exhaustion and release inside her. The air in the warehouse felt clearer now, lighter somehow. For the first time, she believed Marco truly couldn't touch her again. The chains had fallen. After the confrontation, Matteo led her outside. The rain had started again, light but steady. The docks looked almost peaceful under the dim streetlights. She stood by the car, taking deep breaths, the air cold against her skin. Matteo stayed nearby but didn't speak. He seemed lost in thought, eyes tracing the water. She asked if it was really over. He said nothing, just looked toward the dark horizon. She realized the silence wasn't avoidance. It was exhaustion. Both of them had spent years surviving, and survival didn't teach people how to rest. They drove back through the sleeping city. The streets were empty, washed clean by the rain. Elena leaned her head against the window, watching droplets race each other down the glass. Matteo's reflection stared forward, focused but distant. She could tell he was thinking about what came next. She wondered the same. Her life had been about running. She didn't know what to do without fear. The quiet between them wasn't awkward. It was the kind that exists between people who've already shared something unspoken and don't need to fill the space anymore. When they reached the safe house, Matteo unlocked the door, but didn't go in right away. He looked around first, scanning shadows before motioning her inside. Old habits, she thought. He poured himself a drink, then sat across from her at the small table. The lamp flickered again, same as before. She asked him what would happen now. He said Marco's empire would crumble without him, that the city would adjust. Then he added softly that nothing in their world ever really ends. It only changes hands. The truth settled heavy between them. Elena realized she didn't want to go back to her old life just yet. The hospital, the night shifts, the same tired routine, it felt too far from this version of herself. She told Matteo she needed time to think, and he nodded, not surprised. He offered her a place to stay until she figured things out. She accepted, though she wasn't sure why, maybe because for once someone wasn't telling her what to do. Matteo left her the spare room and said he'd handle a few things before dawn. She didn't ask what. In the quiet of the small apartment, Elena sat by the window, watching the rain trail down the glass. She thought about everything she'd lost and what she'd gained. Freedom didn't feel like she expected. It wasn't loud or triumphant. It was small, fragile, and unfamiliar. She looked around the room and noticed Matteo's coat hanging by the door. In its pocket, she found something unexpected, a broken locket with ashes sealed inside. A name was engraved faintly on the edge. She didn't know who it belonged to, but she sensed it mattered deeply. Matteo returned later, quieter than usual. She told him she'd found the locket. He didn't take it back. He said it belonged to his brother, the one who died trying to walk away from their world. The ashes were what was left after the city took everything from him. He said carrying it reminded him of what happens when you stop fighting. Elena understood in that moment that Matteo's strength came from guilt, not pride. She placed the locket gently on the table between them, saying nothing. He left it there. They sat for a long time without speaking. The city outside buzzed faintly with life, but inside the apartment, the world felt paused. Matteo poured another drink and told her she could leave tomorrow if she wanted. She looked at him and asked what he'd do if she stayed. He smiled faintly, almost sad. He said he didn't know, but he'd find a way to make it worth her while. She didn't answer. For the first time, she wasn't deciding out of fear, and that silence between them meant something different. That night, she dreamed of the hospital. The sound of machines, the smell of antiseptic, the long hallways filled with quiet suffering. But this time, when she turned a corner, Matteo was there, waiting, holding a candle that wouldn't go out. He didn't speak, just nodded toward an open door, filled with light. When she woke, her heart was steady. It was the first dream she'd had in years that didn't end in panic. She took it as a sign that maybe, somehow, she was healing in ways she couldn't see yet. Morning light spilled through the window, pale and soft. Matteo was still asleep on the couch, jacket over his chest, phone beside him. She made coffee quietly, trying not to wake him. The smell filled the room, mixing with the faint scent of rain from outside. When he stirred, she handed him a cup, and for a few seconds it felt normal, two people sharing silence without danger chasing them. She realized how rare that feeling was for both of them. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something close enough to matter. They spent the day in quiet tasks. Matteo took calls, handling business. Elena organized the kitchen, grateful for something ordinary to focus on. Every so often, their eyes met, and neither looked away too quickly. She noticed small details about him, the way he tapped his finger when thinking, the faint scar near his temple, the wear in his voice when he said her name. By afternoon, the tension between them had shifted into something calmer, like two storms that had finally learned how to move side by side without colliding. Later, a package arrived, addressed to Matteo with no return label. He opened it carefully. Inside was a small watch that only ticked at midnight. He said nothing at first, just stared at it. Elena asked what it meant. He said it was a message, his brother's watch, taken years ago, now returned. Someone was reminding him that nothing in their world stayed buried. She understood then that peace, for him, was borrowed time. Still, when the clock struck midnight and the ticking started again, he smiled faintly, as if remembering hope. That night they stood by the window, the city lights stretching endlessly. Matteo said the world was quiet now, but quiet never lasted. Elena asked if he regretted helping her. He shook his head. He said some choices don't make sense until after they save you. She thought about that for a long time. Maybe she hadn't been the one saved. Maybe she'd been the reason he remembered what saving someone felt like. The thought settled deep in her chest, warm and strange. For once her fear wasn't louder than her hope. Days passed, and she found herself adjusting to the rhythm of that life. Matteo came and went, always returning before nightfall. She worked on small things, reading, cleaning, cooking meals that reminded her of normal life. The simplicity steadied her. Matteo didn't speak much about his business anymore, but when he did, she could tell he was slowly pulling himself away from it. Every conversation they shared chipped away at the distance between them, not with romance, but with quiet understanding. Two people learning that safety could exist, even if temporary. One evening, they ate dinner together near the window. Rain streaking down again. Matteo asked if she missed nursing. She said yes, but not the exhaustion that came with it. He nodded, saying the city drained everyone eventually. He looked at her hands, still carrying faint marks from her work, and said they weren't built for his world. She smiled and said maybe not, but they survived both worlds so far. Matteo laughed softly, the kind of laugh that carried years of pain behind it. It sounded like release. That night, she couldn't sleep again. She walked to the small balcony, watching the street below. The sound of distant sirens blended with the hum of life. Matteo joined her a few minutes later, wrapping his jacket around her shoulders. They stood quietly, the air damp but not cold. She asked if he ever wished things were different. He said every day, but wishing didn't change much. Then he added softly that meeting her might be the only thing he didn't regret. She didn't respond, but her eyes said enough. The next morning brought news. Matteo's men informed him that someone new was trying to claim Marco's territory. Matteo sighed, unsurprised. He said the city never stayed empty for long. Elena asked if he'd fight again. He said no, not this time. He was done. She could see he meant it, even if the world wouldn't believe him. He told her to pack a bag. They were leaving the city for a while. She didn't ask where. The idea of leaving didn't scare her anymore. It felt like breathing for the first time. They drove for hours through winding roads, passing small towns and open countryside. The silence between them felt peaceful now. Matteo seemed lighter. His grip on the steering wheel relaxed. Elena watched fields pass by, the green endless under the gray sky. When they stopped at a roadside cafe, they shared a meal like ordinary travelers. She realized she hadn't looked over her shoulder once since they left. For someone who lived on fear, that was a kind of miracle. Matteo noticed too, smiling when she said she almost felt normal again. By the time they reached the small coastal town, the sky was clearing. Matteo rented a room, overlooking the sea. The sound of waves filled the quiet space. Elena stood on the balcony, the breeze brushing her face. Matteo leaned against the doorway, watching her without speaking. She turned and asked, what came next? He said they'd decide tomorrow. For now they'd rest. She nodded, looking back at the ocean. For the first time in years, she wasn't waiting for danger. She was waiting for morning. That was its own kind of freedom. Morning sunlight spilled into the room, warm and gentle. The sound of waves drifted through the window, mixed with distant laughter from the streets below. Elena woke before Matteo and stood quietly by the balcony, watching fishermen set out to sea. For the first time in years, her heart felt steady. She didn't know what tomorrow held, but for now that uncertainty didn't scare her. Matteo stirred behind her, his voice still rough with sleep, as he asked if she wanted breakfast. She smiled faintly, realizing how ordinary peace could feel. They walked along the beach after breakfast, shoes in hand, the tide brushing their feet. Matteo spoke little, but when he did, his words were thoughtful. He said every man pays for his choices eventually, even if it takes years. Elena told him she wasn't afraid of his past. He looked at her, almost surprised, then nodded as if accepting something he hadn't allowed himself before. The simplicity of the walk grounded them both. For a brief moment, neither of them was a survivor or a sinner. They were just two people breathing. Later that day, they stopped at a small cafe near the harbor. The owner recognized Matteo, but said nothing, serving them quietly. Elena noticed the respect in the man's eyes. It wasn't fear. She realized Matteo's name carried more weight than she understood. He wasn't just a man with power. He was someone who commanded loyalty in a world where trust was rare. She wondered how much of that loyalty came from kindness, and how much from necessity. Matteo caught her studying him, and smiled knowingly, as if reading her thoughts without needing words. Back at the inn, she found herself drawn to a small wooden desk by the window. On it sat a stack of blank postcards, much like the ones in Matteo's old apartment. She picked one up and began writing, not to anyone, just words she needed to release. She wrote about fear, about strength, about how it felt to live without running. When she was done, she folded the card and placed it under the lamp. It didn't need to be sent. It was enough that she'd finally found the courage to write it. That night, the power flickered once more. The storm outside grew stronger, waves slapping against the shore. Matteo checked the windows while Elena lit a candle on the nightstand. The flame wavered, but didn't go out. She watched it closely, remembering the candle from her dream, the one he held that never died. He caught her staring and asked what she was thinking. She told him she was thinking about second chances. He said those were rare, but when they came, you held on to them until they burned out. She agreed quietly. The storm grew louder through the night. Rain hammered the glass, and thunder rolled across the coastline. Elena couldn't sleep. She sat near the window, wrapped in a blanket, watching the lightning flicker across the sea. Matteo joined her, bringing 2 cups of coffee. They sat together, saying nothing, just listening to the storm. There was comfort in the shared silence, in knowing they didn't have to fill it. For the first time in her life, chaos outside didn't feel threatening. It felt like the world was cleansing itself, washing everything away. By morning, the storm had passed. The streets outside were wet but calm, sunlight breaking through the clouds. Matteo said he needed to make one last trip back to the city, to settle something before they could start over. Elena didn't want him to go, but she didn't stop him either. She understood this wasn't about business. It was about closure. He promised to return before nightfall. She watched him drive off down the narrow coastal road, his car disappearing between cliffs. The empty space he left behind felt heavier than she expected. Elena spent the day wandering the town. She visited the local market, bought fresh fruit, and watched children play by the docks. The normalcy of it all felt unreal. She'd spent years living in fear, and now she was surrounded by life that didn't know her name or story. She sat on a bench near the water, letting the breeze carry her thoughts. Every now and then, she glanced toward the road, waiting for Matteo's car. A part of her worried she'd grown used to waiting for people who might never return. The sun dipped low, turning the sky orange. Matteo still hadn't come back. Elena tried to stay calm, telling herself he'd warned her it might take time, but unease crept in. She walked back to the inn, checked her phone. No calls, no messages. The quiet felt wrong now. She sat on the edge of the bed, fingers brushing the broken locket still sitting on the table. It reminded her that every piece she'd known had come with a price. She told herself she was done being afraid, but her heart disagreed. Hours later, a car pulled up outside. Relief washed over her until she saw the driver. It wasn't Matteo. It was one of his men, face pale, hands shaking. He said Matteo was in trouble, ambushed in the city by remnants of Marco's crew. The deal he went to close was a trap. Elena's stomach dropped. She asked where he was. The man hesitated, saying Matteo told them not to involve her. She grabbed her coat anyway. She'd spent too many years hiding. If Matteo was fighting his past, she would face it too. They drove through the night, back toward the city. The roads were slick, headlights cutting through mist. Elena sat in silence, mind replaying every moment with Matteo, the first meeting, the warnings, the strange safety he offered. She realized she wasn't just worried about losing him, she was afraid of losing what she'd become with him. The closer they got to the city, the more she saw the world she thought she'd left. Dark streets, closed shops, familiar corners of danger. But this time, she wasn't the same woman walking into them. The car stopped outside a warehouse district. Police sirens wailed faintly in the distance. The driver told her Matteo was inside, trying to negotiate his way out. She stepped out before he could stop her. The night air was cold, sharp, carrying the faint smell of smoke. She walked toward the building, each step steady, her fear dulled by purpose. Inside, she could hear shouting, a mix of threats and desperation. She knew this pattern too well, power slipping through dying hands, and in the center of it all was Matteo. She pushed open the door. The scene froze. Matteo stood near a wall, surrounded by armed men. One of them held a gun. Trembling, Elena stepped forward, her voice calm but strong, telling them she was unarmed. Every eye turned toward her. Matteo's expression changed, fear, anger, and disbelief all at once. He told her to leave, but she didn't move. She said if anyone wanted to end this, they'd have to go through her. The room fell silent. Even the gunman hesitated. In that silence, she finally felt control return to her life. Matteo used that hesitation to act. In one swift motion, he disarmed the nearest man, forcing the others to back off. The chaos broke like glass, but within seconds, it was over. The men fled, realizing the fight was lost. Matteo stood breathing heavily, his coat torn, a faint bruise near his temple. Elena ran to him, helping him steady himself. He looked at her, half angry, half grateful. She told him she wasn't leaving him behind. He didn't argue. They walked out together, leaving the remnants of the past behind on that cold floor. Outside, blue lights flickered as police cars arrived. Matteo raised his hands calmly, signaling he wasn't resisting. Elena stood beside him, silent, refusing to move away. The officers surrounded them, confusion clear in their faces. Matteo whispered, that this was the only way to end it cleanly, turn himself in before anyone else paid the price. Elena tried to speak, but he gave her a small nod that stopped her. He wasn't surrendering to them. He was surrendering to peace. That realization broke something in her and mended something else at the same time. The officers escorted him away. Elena followed the car until it disappeared down the street. The night felt endless. She sat on the curb, hands cold, rain beginning to fall again. People passed by, not knowing who she was or what had just happened. She stayed there until the streets emptied, then finally stood and walked back to the car that brought her here. On the passenger seat, she found Matteo's watch, the one that ticked only at midnight. It was still. She slipped it on her wrist and whispered that she'd keep time for him. Days passed in a blur. Reporters filled the news with Matteo's arrest, calling it the end of an era. Elena stayed quiet, watching from a small apartment near the hospital. She went back to work, but nothing felt the same. Every patient reminded her of someone she couldn't fix. At night, she'd sit by the window, listening to the city breathe. She wondered if Matteo could hear it too from wherever he was being held. The watch on her wrist ticked faintly again, starting exactly at midnight, like a reminder that he was still alive. She visited him weeks later. The prison was quiet, sterile, almost like the hospital she worked in. Matteo looked tired but calm behind the glass. He said they were giving him a deal in exchange for information that would keep the peace. He said he'd take it. Elena nodded, knowing he wasn't doing it for freedom but for balance. Before she left, he asked if she'd ever forgive herself for surviving. She didn't answer right away. Then she said survival wasn't something to forgive. It was something to protect. He smiled faintly. After the visit, Elena walked through the city, seeing it differently now. The same streets that once felt dangerous now felt familiar. She noticed people laughing outside cafes, a child running after pigeons, a couple arguing softly over groceries. Life kept moving, unbothered by history. She realized she wasn't trapped in her past anymore. She was part of something larger, ordinary life. And in that ordinariness, there was beauty. She passed by the club where it all began. The lights were dimmer now, the name faded, but it no longer held power over her. She started writing again, this time letters to Matteo. She didn't know if they'd reach him, but it didn't matter. The act of writing kept her connected. She wrote about her days at the hospital, about patients who reminded her that hope was stubborn. She ended every letter with the same line, "The watch still ticks." It became their code for survival, a quiet message that life continued. With each letter, her fear faded a little more. Her story wasn't one of escape anymore. It was one of rebuilding. Months passed. The city softened under spring light. Elena moved into a new apartment overlooking a small park. The air smelled of blooming jasmine, and children played outside after school. She found comfort in the rhythm of small things. Morning coffee, late walks, the laughter of neighbors through thin walls. One day, she received a letter without a return address. Inside was a single photograph of the ocean, with 3 words written on the back. "It's almost time." Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from recognition. She knew it was Matteo's handwriting. The message was brief, but it carried weight. She didn't know if time meant freedom, reunion, or something else. That night she couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, holding the photograph, listening to the city hum below. The watch ticked faintly on her wrist, steady as a heartbeat. She realized that even if Matteo never came back, he'd already given her something she couldn't lose, control over her own life. She smiled quietly, tears softening her eyes. The past had built her cage, but love, or something like it, had taught her the door was open. Weeks later, she heard the news quietly from a colleague. Matteo had been released early under protective custody. No one knew where he went. Elena didn't try to find him. She went to the beach instead, standing where the waves met the sand. She imagined him somewhere far away, maybe at that vineyard he once mentioned, breathing easier under open skies. She whispered a thank you, not for saving her, but for reminding her what strength looked like. The wind carried her words into the surf, and she felt lighter than she had in years. Back in the city, she returned to her work fully. She volunteered for night shifts again, the kind she used to dread. Helping others no longer drained her. It reminded her she still had purpose. Her coworkers noticed the change in her. She smiled more, spoke softer, moved with quiet confidence. On her wrist, the midnight watch ticked faintly, keeping time with her heartbeat. Each night at midnight, she'd glance at it and think of the man who turned chaos into clarity, not through promises, but through presence. That was enough. One evening, as she left the hospital, she heard a distant bell ring through the streets. It was faint, almost out of place, but familiar. She looked toward the sound and saw a man walking across the road, coat collar turned up against the wind. For a moment, she thought it was him, but the man kept walking, disappearing into the crowd. She smiled instead of chasing. Maybe some people didn't need to return to stay with you. She walked home under the soft city lights, carrying peace that no one could take away. Spring turned to summer quietly. The city moved at its usual rhythm, unaware of the story it had held. Elena's days blended into steady patterns of work and rest. Sometimes she caught herself thinking about Matteo, where he might be, whether he was free, or if freedom even meant the same thing to him anymore. The thought no longer hurt, it just felt unfinished, like a book she didn't need to reread to know how it ended. She found peace in that unspoken understanding between them, something beyond words or distance. On her day off, she walked through the park near her apartment. Children ran past, laughter filling the air. A vendor sold roasted chestnuts by the fountain, and she stopped to buy one, smiling at the smell. Ordinary life felt precious now, something she didn't take for granted. She sat on a bench, watching the clouds shift lazily across the blue sky. Her phone buzzed once, an unknown number. She almost ignored it, but answered. The line was quiet for a few seconds, before a familiar voice said softly, "You still keeping time?" Her breath caught for a second. She didn't need to ask who it was. Matteo's voice carried that same calm, that quiet steadiness she had memorized. She said yes, that the watch still ticked. He chuckled softly, saying that meant everything was still in motion. She wanted to ask where he was but stopped herself. He said he couldn't stay in one place long, not yet, but he was safe. He thanked her for believing him, for reminding him he could still be something other than what the city made him. The call was short. When it ended, she sat there for a long time, holding the phone in her lap. She felt both full and empty at once. Matteo was alive. That was enough. The sun began to set, painting the park in gold and orange. The sound of church bells drifted faintly through the air. She looked down at her wrist. The watch ticked precisely at midnight hours, just as it always had. It reminded her that endings didn't have to close things completely. Some stories kept breathing quietly in the background. That night, she opened her old journal. Pages filled with half-written thoughts and memories stared back at her. She turned to a blank page and began writing again, not about pain or fear, but about growth. She wrote how healing wasn't a single moment, it was a series of choices made in silence. She wrote that people don't save us, they remind us what saving ourselves looks like. When she finished, she closed the book gently. It wasn't closure she needed, only acknowledgement that the past had shaped her, not defined her. Weeks passed quietly. Elena built new routines, morning walks, evening reading, short calls with her mother again. She reconnected with parts of her life she'd left untouched for too long, yet sometimes, at night, she still caught herself looking at the horizon, wondering if Matteo was looking at the same sky. The thought didn't bring sadness anymore, only warmth. Their lives had split into different paths, but they shared the same thread, the moment two broken worlds crossed long enough to remember what being whole could feel like. That was their connection now. One evening, she received a small package with no name. Inside was a single item, a bottle filled with sand and a folded note. The sand sparkled faintly, as if touched by sunlight. The note read, "From a place that finally feels quiet, no signature." She smiled, running her fingers over the glass. It wasn't a promise of return. It was a message of peace. She placed it beside the broken locket and the postcards, tiny reminders of a story that mattered because it taught her how to live again without fear. Her life began to settle into balance. The hospital became less of an escape and more of a purpose again. Patients came and went, and she learned to carry their stories without letting them weigh her down. Every so often, someone would remind her of Matteo, a glance, a tone, a certain stubbornness, but it no longer hurt. It felt like an echo from another time. She realized healing didn't mean forgetting. It meant remembering differently, without letting it break you each time the memory surfaced. That realization was its own freedom. Late one night, she took a walk through the city's old quarter. The streets were quiet, the kind of quiet she once feared. Now it felt gentle. She passed the alley where she first met Matteo, the same flickering streetlight still there. She stopped beneath it, staring up. The rain began again, light and steady. She closed her eyes, letting it soak through her hair. That night came rushing back, the chaos, the fear, the protection, and the voice that said, "Stay behind me." She smiled softly, realizing she no longer needed anyone to stand in front. Back at home, she lit a candle on the windowsill and watched it burn. The flame moved softly with the air, steady but alive. She thought of how Matteo once said that some fires aren't meant to destroy, only to show the way forward. She understood now. The light didn't represent him. It represented her strength to keep walking. She whispered a quiet goodbye into the still room, not because she needed to let him go, but because she finally knew she could carry him without losing herself. That was real peace. As days turned into months, her world grew brighter in small, ordinary ways. New faces at work, laughter at coffee breaks, the comfort of routine. People began to notice the calm in her, a quiet confidence that seemed to come from nowhere. She never told them where it came from. It wasn't a story for everyone. Some truths lived better in the heart than in words. Every midnight, she still listened for the watches ticking and smiled, knowing it connected two lives that had taught each other how to survive. One afternoon, she received a postcard in the mail. It had no message, only a photograph of a vineyard under a soft Italian sunset. She knew immediately. The image was beautiful, rows of vines stretching toward the horizon, golden light spilling over them. She turned it over and found one short sentence. "It's quiet here." Her eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but gratitude. Matteo had found what he'd once described, and somehow that made her world feel safer too. She placed the postcard with the others, her heart lighter than before. As autumn came, she started volunteering to train new nurses. She found herself repeating advice she never used to give, about patience, empathy, and not losing yourself in the weight of other people's pain. The younger nurses admired her calmness. They said she had a way of making chaos feel manageable. She smiled each time, thinking of Matteo's quiet strength. Maybe, she thought, he hadn't saved her life. Maybe he just handed her a mirror and let her see the parts that could still shine, even after everything went dark. One cold evening, she walked by the waterfront, the same docks where everything had changed. The city skyline reflected off the water, glowing in patches of gold and blue. She stopped at the edge, leaning against the railing, remembering how she once stood there terrified. Now she stood steady. A bell from a distant ship rang softly, echoing through the night. She looked down at the watch. It was nearly midnight. The ticking grew faint but clear. She whispered a thank you to the wind, not expecting an answer, but feeling one anyway. When she returned home, she found an envelope slipped under her door. Inside was a small metal key, wrapped in a ribbon, old but polished. Attached was a note with simple handwriting. "For whenever you need to start over, no name again." But she didn't need one. She held it tightly, smiling through tears. It wasn't a request or an invitation. It was a reminder that new doors always existed, waiting to be opened. She placed the key beside the watch, the sand bottle, and the postcard, a small altar of endings and beginnings. Winter came quietly. Snow fell across the city, soft and endless. Elena walked home after a long shift, the streets glowing under pale streetlights. She watched her breath rise into the cold air, feeling grateful for the stillness. In her apartment, she lit another candle and set it beside the window. Outside, snowflakes melted against the glass, catching the light. She poured herself tea and sat down, listening to the faint hum of the city. Peace didn't roar. It whispered, reminding her that she had finally learned how to live without fear. She wrote one last letter that night, not addressed to anyone, just words for herself. She wrote about how people come into our lives to teach lessons we can't learn alone. Some stay, some leave, but their impact lingers like fingerprints on the soul. She wrote that love doesn't always mean forever. It sometimes means freedom. When she finished, she placed the letter beside the rest and exhaled. The candle's flame leaned toward her hand for a second before straightening again, as if acknowledging what she'd finally released into the world. In the months that followed, Elena became known at the hospital for her steadiness under pressure. Patients trusted her easily. Doctors relied on her without question. Her life wasn't glamorous, but it was meaningful. One evening, as she left work, she saw a man standing across the street, watching quietly. Her heart skipped, but when a bus passed, he was gone. She smiled instead of chasing the image. Some things were meant to remain just out of reach, proof that not every story needs a final page to feel complete. That night, she went to the park again, the same bench where Matteo once called her. The city lights shimmered on the pond, and the air was cool. She sat with her hands folded, watching the reflection of stars ripple across the water. A couple nearby laughed softly. She felt at peace with the distance between past and present. Somewhere out there, she believed Matteo was alive, maybe watching a sky just like this one. That thought didn't ache anymore. It comforted her like an old song she never forgot the words to. The next morning, she woke to sunlight spilling across her floor. The clock read exactly midnight on her wristwatch. Though it was well past dawn, it had stopped ticking. She smiled, not sad, but knowing what it meant. It wasn't broken, it had simply finished its purpose. She set it on the table beside her other keepsakes. Every symbol of her journey stood together now, quiet and still. She whispered a soft goodbye to the chapter that had shaped her. Sometimes, she thought, closure comes not through endings, but through acceptance. Years passed gently. Elena grew older, her hair streaked with silver, her face calm and kind. The city changed, but her small apartment by the park remained the same. She still lit candles every winter, still walked by the waterfront on quiet nights. People around her saw peace. They never knew the storms she'd weathered to find it. She carried that past like a story etched into her heart, not as pain, but as proof. The woman who once ran from her life now walked through it with quiet grace and strength. One evening, as she closed the clinic for the night, a nurse handed her a small envelope left at reception. Inside was a photograph of a vineyard under a bright sky, nearly identical to the one Matteo had sent years before. But this time, there was a child in the picture, running through the vines. On the back, it said only, "He's named after hope." She laughed softly, tears forming as she imagined Matteo, older now, maybe free in his own way. It felt like the world had come full circle in silence. That night, she placed the new photograph beside the others. Her small collection of mementos had grown into something more, a record of a life rebuilt from ashes. Each object carried a story, a lesson, a heartbeat, frozen in time. She sat by the window again, candle burning low, thinking about how every storm she'd feared had brought her closer to this peace. Outside, snow fell again, soft as whispers. The world felt safe, even fragile, and she loved it for exactly that reason. Life, she thought, was always worth returning to. As she prepared for bed, she caught her reflection in the mirror. The woman staring back wasn't the frightened nurse from years ago. Her eyes held warmth instead of worry, her posture calm instead of guarded. She smiled, not at the image, but at the journey that had shaped it. Every scar, every memory, had its place. She blew out the candle, the last curl of smoke fading into the still air. Somewhere deep inside, she knew Matteo's voice would always echo when she needed courage. That was her constant companion. Outside, a distant bell rang across the city. Elena opened her window and listened. The sound was faint but steady, like a heartbeat keeping time. She looked toward the horizon, the city lights stretching far beyond her view. She whispered one final thank you, to fate, to life, to the man who once told her to stay behind him, and to the strength that taught her she could walk ahead on her own. As the bell faded, the city exhaled with her. The night was peaceful, and she finally was too.